Thanks everybody for tuning in to today's Madison Network podcast. So today's really exciting with our podcast because not only is this season 1, but this is episode 1. And I'm really excited to have Rachel Nusbaum join me for today's podcast. And she's going to be focusing on a topic from struggle to strength, rewriting your story. So some of you, if you've been tapping into the Madison Network resources and programs, may recognize Rachel. Rachel did do a blog feature for us just a little while ago, which was a really interesting look into what she's doing as far as her business, The Orchid Story. With Rachel, she is a partner, a mom, daughter, sister who writes in pursuit of connection with herself as well as with others. Sharing the journey of her son's diagnosis of congenital heart disease on a national stage was the inspiration behind Rachel's creative business, as I mentioned, The Orchid Story. The mission with The Orchid Story, and I'm sure Rachel can jump in to elaborate a little more, but it's to empower individuals to tell their stories of struggle as a path to find freedom and meaning. Rachel, did you want to elaborate a little bit more about The Orchid Story and your business's mission?
Sure. Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you, Emma. I'm so excited to be here and to be part of the launching of the JMU podcast. And yeah, as I was thinking about sort of the origin of Orchid Story, it was a couple of things that came together. I had that experience of sharing my son's diagnosis, the story of that on a national stage. But while that was really empowering for me and I got a lot of great feedback, the process of doing that and really just diving into the hard things we experienced along the way with Griffin, I think was what really allowed me to kind of find some space for my life and for me to move on. And after all of that, I kind of thought to myself, well, this would be great to share with other people and to help other people along this road. I had been in academia for a long time and had been writing more science type of articles and manuscripts, and I loved the shift into the more personal writing and personal storytelling.
Right. Well, you mentioned kind of the more science side of things. So for our listeners, Rachel is an alum of James Madison University, go Dukes,
Right.
And was an integrated science and technology major, right?
Right. Yeah. I was actually among the first classes of ISET majors. I don't know if I was the first class in the building, but one of the first classes before I came, there was a lot more done in like modular type of buildings. So things have changed so much since I was there.
Yes, campus has expanded immensely.
Yeah, but I feel like ISAT really has played a key role in all parts of my story, and some of just like the basic things that I learned at JMU and really within ISAT, like teaching and writing and having my own mentors and now being mentors for, I work with graduate students too. It's just, it's so fun to look back and to recognize how those threads have been there all along.
Well, it always seems we talk about the Madison experience not only as a student, but as you're kind of demonstrating right now, that continues beyond our graduation or walking across that stage in that big moment, that we can still find those nuggets of connection with one another, with the university, through the work that we're doing, the volunteer kind of things that we're doing, or just pursuing different passions. It looks like you also received your MS in genetic counseling from the University of Pittsburgh and have been a genetic counselor for 12 years, both in the academia and industry fields. How has that experience kind of shaped where you find yourself today?
Yeah, it's been an interesting road. Sitting with patients for genetic counseling sessions was also part of the fuel to this whole storytelling piece. So I spent so many days of my working life in the last decade and more sitting across from the table of people who are going through a really hard time. Most of my experiences in oncology, so with patients generally that have cancer, and hearing their story and just the personal side of things, and sort of integrating the medical piece and the genetics, of course, that's why I'm there, but really getting the psychosocial side of things too. And really feeling that patients get something out of sharing their story. So it was a way to weave in my favorite part of genetic counseling into Orchid's story.
With Orchid's story, and you talk about your career, and I know you mentioned your own personal story with your son Griffin. How did you really get Orchid's story, you know, from that nugget of an idea in your head to where it is now? I know when people talk with entrepreneurs, you know, it's kind of like, oh well, it kind of came together. You know, but could you kind of talk us through what that coming together even looks like?
Yeah, and it's still coming together. I will say I launched the business in the fall of 2016, so it's been a little over a year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm still really feeling things out, and I do this part-time. Like I mentioned, I still work as a genetic counselor part-time. So I am totally still figuring this out. But it's interesting because even though I had the whole experience with sharing my story about Griffin, and I did feel at that time like, huh, there's something here. It didn't really sink in like there was a business here or anything like that. So I went on with my life. I was actually working at a job at that time that I didn't particularly love. It was a great company and it was a really wonderful team, but the actual work itself was like not super engaging and exciting for me. And I had taken to listening to podcasts actually. And I had been listening to a lot of podcasts by female creative entrepreneurs. So like writers, photographers, branding experts, marketing, all sorts of different people, but a lot of women. And I just was so inspired by like, who are these people and what are they doing? And so after, I don't know, probably about a year of listening to these and planting the seed, I decided to sign up for an online business class with 2 business coaches and a graphic designer. And the end product of the course was that you would get a website and launch a business. I didn't even know what the business would be at that time. I was actually thinking I would probably have a private practice genetic counseling business. That just seemed like kind of the easiest, I guess lowest hanging fruit sort of thing.
More clear path, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that would be easy, quote unquote,
right.
Really, you know, it would require a lot, but it would have made sense, I think, and I'm so logical and planned. But as I really dove into it and did all the exercises with these coaches, it became clear that my heart wasn't really in the private practice genetic counseling piece, and really the writing and the storytelling, just I kept coming back around to that. And so I had been actually writing, personal writing, just privately on the side, sharing it a little bit for a while by then. And so I was like, well, I love writing and I love sharing my own stories and hearing other people's stories and sharing those. So like, what can I do to put these pieces together? And so it's been like, all right, what kind of offering could I put together that's related to all these different pieces? And so I came up with one offering, and now that's expanded to classes. And I started doing a little bit of, I guess, putting my toe into one-on-one coaching. And it's just really like, let's try this next thing and see how it works. And I have had so many things, even in 1 year, that have not worked. But I just keep, you know, pushing ahead little by little, like what's the next step I can take.
Well, you keep growing, you keep learning, like anything that any of us do is really, as long as you're moving forward, right? And the whole core of what you're doing is just such an amazing way for those that, as you mentioned, that are going through difficult situations where a lot of the times we want to kind of clam up within ourselves and kind of keep that storm internally, when really we just need to get it out. And the fact that your business model seems to focus on how to kind of pour that out of individuals in their own way, I think is impressive. You mentioned that even before this, you had your own personal writing. I don't know what that looks like. For me, I'm not personally a writer myself, but when I'm out getting my coffee or Starbucks, I see lots of people sitting with their journals and everything, finding those cozy nooks. So with you, are you one of those that I'm probably passing by in a Starbucks, or what is your writing environment? What does your process look like when you're putting your story down on paper?
Well, in the beginning, that was me. So in the beginning, this is just like to demonstrate that you very rarely can jump into something like all the way, right? So I was working full time. I took 1 hour a week, Friday mornings. My husband would get the kids up and get them ready for school, and I would go out to the coffee shop and write for an hour. And I did that for probably, I don't know, 6 to 12 months before I had even started the business or even started trying to get my work published. So that just shows, it's like little by little. And now, over the course of the last couple of years, I do have some of my own personal work that has been published. And now writing for me has become more of a habit. I actually love writing. I really feel like I get so much out of being in that space. And so if that's not you, there's other things that you can do.
To share my story.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a habit of getting up really early when the house is really quiet and writing now. And I have more, just the way that my life is set up at this moment, I do have more time to work on and focus on my writing. But you know what I do to get started most often is, like, when I'm walking the dog or taking a shower, and this is all of us, I believe, get little nuggets of thoughts or just little intuitions that kind of float into your head. And I really try to write those down because I can't remember them. They come to me and they go, and if I don't pay attention to them, nothing comes of it. So I looked at my most recent one because I'll either write them in the little notebook or write them in the notes app on my phone. So before we got on the podcast, I looked at my most recent one on my phone, and it says, "Why am I waiting for an apology or a pat on the back from the universe?" Like, so that's an interesting thought that would be worth exploring. So,
that's a deep thought.
I mean, sometimes it's not a deep thought at all, but sometimes it is, and like I can go from something seemingly abstract to, well, like, what's the tangible way that this is coming out in my life, and what are the details surrounding this? And that's just kind of the way that I found works for me for writing.
Right. Do you find that you can get out that story or that nugget in like one session, or do you find yourself sometimes going back to the same piece for multiple occasions? What does that look like to you?
Definitely both for me, all of it. Actually, my most recent essay that was published online just last week, I looked back and I started writing it in 2015.
Oh, wow.
So I do that sometimes. I start something and then I just lose interest, or like I don't have a good focus. This isn't really compelling to me, so it won't be compelling to anyone else, and I'll kind of put it aside. And then there are other pieces where it just like comes out, and it might, it's pretty messy, that first draft, and needs a lot of editing, but the meat of it is there and I can work with it right away. So I'd say both, but definitely patience. It's so hard, but you really have to have a lot of patience with writing.
Exactly. And I know you talk a lot about writing down that story, and that there are opportunities, and I know you've had opportunities to actually read those stories aloud. Do you mind sharing maybe one of the more powerful moments you've experienced, sharing one of your pieces?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I have, I do talk a lot about that that time at that national genetics meeting when I shared Griffin's story, and that was really powerful because there were a lot of sort of really well-known physicians in the room who I think were kind of blown away by the personal side of things, and that was really meaningful for me as a parent going through that. But aside from that, I was thinking about in the last year, what's a really powerful moment. And one for me that came up was I had the opportunity to do a storytelling evening, I guess you could say, with an organization called Listen to Your Mother, which was a group of 13 women in DC who got on a stage in front of a live audience and read a personal story that we had each written. And it was so moving. It was moving because my own story that I wrote and then read that day was the first time that I had talked publicly about the impact of my mom's dementia diagnosis. So it was like very meaningful for me. And I had my sister and some of my best friends in the crowd, which was just really powerful. But then also just to hear the other women's stories, and I felt connected to every single one of them, and they couldn't have been more different than me. And that's what I love about telling stories is like almost always you can resonate with something in someone else's story. So it was just a really special event that I was involved in this year.
Well, it shows, with all of our differences, all of our paths that we've taken, we're all human, and that we do have experiences, both good and bad. And to have moments like that of vulnerability, when I think a lot of times, yes, it's definitely encouraged that we show emotion and connect and everything, but obviously it's also, there's all this taboo conversation about, keeping that bottled inside. And so I definitely can understand what you're saying with how powerful of a moment that must have been, and how cool it would be to hear such different stories, but be able to still have this kind of tie to what everyone was sharing. And I think it just all goes back to, you know what? We're all human here, and we're all doing the best that we can with the situations that we're currently in or have gone through.
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
So what's really exciting for those tuning in is that part of today's podcast is I had asked Rachel if she would consider writing a piece and sharing it with us. And happy to say that that is the case. And so I'm going to turn things over to Rachel to read through one of her pieces that she has written for us to hear on this podcast, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit more about the inspiration behind this particular story.
Okay, sounds great. So here we go. It's fall, school is in full swing, and all you can see turning 360 degrees are fields of little kids playing soccer. The sky gleams that special shade of blue reserved for October, and the trampled grass stands out in every direction. If you have a child who's at least 4 years old and you live in Northern Virginia, and probably elsewhere, you know this scene. At first glance, it's all rainbows and sunshine. The coach's wife has beautifully tie-dyed the team t-shirts. Ribbons carefully wrapped around ponytails fly as the girls chase the ball. Proud parents stand on the sidelines holding their coffee, smiling and cheering on their 7-year-old daughters. Hugs abound on the field after a teammate gets a goal. Except, wait, was that an elbow? The other girl is on the ground looking a little dazed. Sunshine and rainbows replaced by dark clouds in my head. Who is that girl who's steamrolling the rest? Oh, she's my daughter, Carly. Do all parents think their kids stand out? In my mind, she's the tallest. She's the fastest. She's loud, and she likes to voice all the injustices she's suffered. If you watch her for a couple of minutes, you'll likely see physical contact. You'll definitely see full speed running without a second thought about whether someone, whether it's an opponent or a teammate, might be in her path. You'll see what it looks like to play without fear. Certainly it's exhilarating to watch, but it's also a pit in my stomach. Each collision makes my stomach do a flip-flop. If she were a boy, would I be so uptight? I love and respect the way she plays, but a big part of me wants to scream, play nice. I hold myself back, though. It's hard to describe this internal conflict. I think that most moms and dads want to raise girls to become strong, independent women. This is definitely the case for me. But I don't parent in a vacuum. When we are out in public, the world around me likes to correct my daughter. Quiet down, sit still, play nice. So it's a balancing act. Throwing an elbow is crossing the line. But playing aggressively and with passion, well, those are qualities that I want to highlight, not dim. Sometimes staying quiet on the sidelines is the best I can do. Earlier this fall, we had a party at our house, and my sister brought the game Pie Face. Do you know that game? The idea is that you put a mound of whipped cream on the hand, which is a lever. Then you pick a card with a number on it and turn the handles that connect to this hand the number of times as dictated by the card that you drew. At any moment, the lever can snap up and hit you in the face as you rest your chin on a little shelf. Cold and wet whipped cream on my face. No, thank you. But guess who loves this game? Yes, my Carly. Now 8, she's the eldest of the kids, but by far the most excited to play. She's first up, and though she picks the card with the number 5, I think I notice her turning the handles extra times to make sure she gets the whipped cream in her face. Within 30 seconds of starting, she's whipped cream covering her entire face, dripping down her shirt, and in her always unruly hair. And she's ecstatic. She pushes her way onto the chair in front of the torture device, grabbing more turns than anyone else. At one point, I look over and I see my friend Matt, who's the dad of one of the kids, holding the can of whipped cream over my daughter's tilted up head and squirting it directly into her mouth. Again, the urge to scream out, "Play nice," and stop my daughter seizes me. Here comes the internal debate again. Is this appropriate behavior? Too much sugar? But again, my desire to let her be who she is wins out. I hold my tongue and stick to the potatoes I'm boiling for our dinner. After the game ends, I'm still there in the kitchen, recovering from the frenzy with my husband Kurt and our friend Matt. The kids are now playing outside, and Matt says, "Who did Carly get the wild side from?" Another image pops into my brain when he asks me this. Let me take you on a slight detour to tell you about it. It's from that post-college, pre-marriage time in my life. I was visiting my sister at her college in Ohio for siblings weekend. Matt is a childhood friend that went to college with my sister, and so his little brother was also there. So this was a mini reunion of 4 friends from our old neighborhood, and this was college. So my sister was having a party in the house where she lived, and all 4 of us were there. Lots of drunken shenanigans were happening, and there were a lot of people in this house all night long. At about 3 a.m. or maybe 5 a.m., I was really tired. I was only 1 or 2 years out of college, JMU, myself, but apparently couldn't hang with this crew. So I did what any responsible 22-year-old would do. I tried to end the party. "Okay, everybody," I screamed, "it's time for bed. See you later, party's over." And that's how I earned the nickname Grandma from Matt and his little brother. So going back to the pie face day in the kitchen, Matt asks, "Where did Carly get her wild side from?" My husband looks directly at me and says, "Definitely not from me." At which point I look at Matt and say, "You remember that you nicknamed me Grandma, right?" So why does it matter so much to me where she gets her personality from? I think it's because it's just so different than mine that I feel compelled to understand its origin. I think at least some of the reason it matters to me is that I'm a scientist. I live in the world of genetics as a genetic counselor, and we take complicated, abstract concepts and statistics and relay them in a way that makes sense to the patient sitting in front of us. So when it came to my firstborn, I had it all planned out. My husband has blue eyes. Mine are brown. Brown is dominant, so she would likely have brown eyes. Kurt's almost a foot taller than me, so she'd likely wind up height-wise somewhere in the middle. And for her personality, it was sure to be a mixture of my dedication and drive and his kind and sensitive nature. Well, she did get the brown eyes. She would definitely be taller than me. Carly has hints of our personality traits, but they're mostly hidden under her own truly unique persona. I love the predictability of genetics and the way we can assign numbers and hard facts to chance. But one of those hard facts is that we can't make predictions with 100% certainty. There will always be outliers, and it just so happens that I am the mother to one such outlier.
I wish I had a little applause button. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
See, and that's the power of the stories. Not only, I want to get your thoughts even just reading that aloud, but as the listener and hearing, I could see myself there. I could picture my own daughter probably being best friends with Carly. They seem very similar. And just really powerful. Like your story took me places, both in my mind, emotionally, and that I think really showcases what it is that you do and the power of storytelling. So as you were reading this, what emotions were you feeling, or what kind of stemmed or inspired you to share this particular piece with us?
Well, probably because it's one of those stories in my own life that I'm working on rewriting right now. And when I use that word rewrite, it doesn't have to necessarily be right. I think the important part is the prefix, the re. So it's like the idea of just going back into the stories that we tell ourselves. So what I've been telling myself about Carly literally since the day she was born is that she's so different than me. I don't understand her. She's so hard to parent. All of the normal parenting strategies don't work. She's not always happy because we always are in conflict because she's a challenging kid. And so if that's my story about Carly, like that's not a great way for her to be experiencing the world and growing up. And I really do want to I do want her to be that strong, independent woman, of course, that I describe in the piece. And so going back and like picking these scenes apart, and these are more recent. So the beauty is that you can do this like for any story that you have really in your life that you can remember, and pulling out like what piece of Carly is shining here. And like she's having so much fun with Pie Face. And like that is amazing. It's so different.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't want to go near it.
I want to play that game.
She's like having the time of her life, and she's literally the life of the party. Everyone wants to be near her. She's a ball of fire, and like that's really cool. And so without going back and re-examining it and diving into that, I would just be like, I'm trying to make dinner, you're causing a ruckus, and going back to the old stories in my head. So it's just like a really good and really easy example of how we can rewrite our stories, not just on paper, but like in our own minds as well.
Well, what was really interesting about this story is I think a lot of us can get caught up in, the day-to-day, the mundane. You talk about in that particular piece, you're cooking dinner, you're at a soccer game. And that if we really, really tune in to the moment, that there is a story there. To share. So when with your business, you've mentioned doing one-on-one coaching or classes, kind of workshop style. Do you find that your clients that you're working with are seeking you to get one story out, or are you seeing them returning and kind of seeking that guidance, kind of more like a life coach situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I probably haven't had enough experience, like say, well, this is my general, the people that come see me. But
right.
if I'm thinking about a couple of particular clients that I've worked with, I think the idea of like a life story or telling my story seems so huge. So how can we start at one place? And like we don't have to write our entire life story in one document, one book, one sitting. We can pick it apart and like dive into these just tiny little nuggets, like you said, of the day to day, and really pull out so much that's meaningful. And for those like traumatic events, really examine like if we can find something positive that did come out of a really dark time. That's kind of the idea there. But to zero in, or I guess maybe narrow in is a better way of saying it, rather than trying to grapple with like, what is my story?
I like the idea of breaking it down. I mean, that's totally my personality. How you're describing your client is exactly how I would come to you, being like, that seems too big,
Yeah.
too scary, too much work. But to be able to break it down into moments, or just small pieces. I mean, I have, nuggets just floating around in my head all the time. So I think your earlier advice of, just grab a journal, grab something and jot it down, just that one line, and see where that one line can take you.
And even if you never do anything with those one-liners, at least you have them. And I mean, maybe it's like funny stuff that your kid says that you want to document. But I find, and it's kind of like the same thing as a gratitude practice in a way. It's like, I'm in the here and now. What can I recognize that happened to me today, and like take hold of it and make sense of it. Just there's lots of little ways to get started with your story. It doesn't have to be like, this is my life story that I'm going to publish into a book.
Absolutely. Well, Rachel, I appreciate you sharing your piece with us. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners about the process or about Orchid Story before we sign off on our episode?
I think the idea when I write or talk about rewriting your story really does resonate with people who've had a significant loss or maybe an illness or a trauma in themselves or someone close to them. But in reality, like, all of us have these stories that would be helpful to re-examine. And I strongly feel that going back and digging into them and pulling out the nuggets and learning from our own stories can just be really empowering.
Well, Rachel summed it up perfectly there. Again, thanks everyone for tuning in to our Season 1, Episode 1 of the Madison Network podcast, where we featured today our alumna 2001, Rachel Nusbaum, who is also the founder of Orchid Story. Definitely check out Orchid Story at www.orchidstory.com. And also feel free to reach out to your Madison Network on the JMU Alumni Association website. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and until next time, I'm your host, Emma Maynard.
Thanks, Emma.